大家好，我是温铁军。我们现在要进入的是一个美国教授，他叫迈克尔·赫德森。他呢的第4讲是讲东西方对经济租金的不同观念和应对。他这一讲里边第1节讲的是19世纪反地租斗争的失败及其历史性后果。在这一讲里面，他首先介绍的是当代美国遭遇到严重的债务危机，经济出现实体部门的大幅度下滑，而金融资本占据 GDP 的比重越来越高。我们大家都知道，美国是一个所谓高度现代化的国家，而高度现代化的一个重要标志就是所谓服务业，而服务业呢，又是以金融服务为主要内容的。那金融为主的服务业占美国 GDP 的比重长期高达 85% 以上。它的实体部门以工业、农业这2个大的实体产业为主，那工业只占 11% 左右，农业呢只占 1. 几。所以呢，和工业和农业相关的各个领域都出现了比较严重的衰败趋势，特别是就业。大家也都知道，美国在这次新冠疫情的打击之下，它这个失业率不断攀升，大量的人呢失去了他们的财产，包括失去了房子，很多地方呢老百姓只能沿街搭棚子住。这些在迈克尔·赫德森的分析之中，他认为主要是金融成了吃租的经济部门，而他这个分析呢是认为从19世纪西方资本主义就逐渐发生了实质性的改变，主要的那些收益呢被吃租的这些部门占有，原来是吃地租，影响了工商业的发展。现在呢是金融变成了一个租源，于是乎吃金融资本的租。而这个租呢，其实在美国的经济的各个领域中，各个部门随着它的全面金融化，那包括住房、医疗、教育、消费，乃至于基础设施、公共服务等等，大量的收入被迫用于支付各种贷款、债务利息，导致老百姓用于购买服务的资金、用于购买商品的资金呢都减少。也就是说，在他看来呢，这个是一个严重失衡的经济结构。那也因此呢，就导致它的实体经济，特别是工业部门走了下坡路。那这些在进入生产之前的租的收益极大的提高了，因为人们必须支付啊，于是乎提高了劳动力的实际成本，就导致美国的竞争力严重下降。这些呢，就是所谓债务经济最终演化为经济紧缩的主要原因。那说到这些现实问题的时候呢，他接着又说，这是从19世纪那个时候就已经开始的。19世纪的政治经济学就是新生资产阶级反对封建的这个土地贵族的理论武器。那他认为呢，主要是围绕着地租是否应该被征税的争论，但这场斗争呢失败了。那不仅古典政治经济学被抛弃了，地租也没有被完全征税，并且随着现代西方金融资本主义的发展，地租呢就金融化了，接着呢又与房地产等金融部门，特别是容易走向虚拟经济扩张的这些部门结合起来了。通过债务信贷的扩张，导致经济租金连同整个经济的成本都提高了。那在这个讨论之后呢，他又进一步研究了就是对地租征税的合理性的讨论。从概念和定义上来看，地租不属于生产成本，而是垄断特权产生的对收益分配的排他性占有。也就是说，对地租征税并不会导致生产成本的上升，就没有这种副作用。相反，这是对实力阶层的免费午餐。也就是说，实力阶层主要是吃租嘛，他们就等于占有了免费午餐。也因此呢，它本来就应当被作为私人财富来征直接税。这个征的税呢，用于提供基础设施建设和公共服务。那同时，由于对地租征税，就可以减少对劳动力的征税，这些呢都可以降低 生产成本。
To talk about economic rent and housing and how China can avoid the problems that the United States has suffered from. How can you keep your housing and your commercial real estate affordable so that you're not going to raise the cost of living and raise the cost of doing business and have to price yourself out of the market? Now, to put this another way, how can you avoid catching the American disease of rising housing prices that force new home buyers to go deeply into debt, into mortgage debt to buy a house? So much debt that they have less and less income available to spend on goods and services. That's called debt deflation. And you also have rent deflation. If rent rises, then you have less to spend on other things. If you have to go into debt to buy housing, then you have less to spend. That is the problem that the Americans have right now. Now, so far, China and other countries have avoided many of the American problems of finance capitalism. For instance, you've avoided privatized medical and healthcare. That absorbs 18% of the American GDP. You've also avoided the student loan problem of having to borrow maybe $50,000 for each class you take, and that leaves a big, heavy debt that leaves graduates unable to spend very much or even to get a home of their own. In America, more and more graduates have to stay living with their parents because of the heavy student debt, because America charges for the education. Now, all of these financial costs are responsible for post-industrializing the United States. So it obviously is advisable for China to treat banking and land ownership and education and healthcare as public utilities. That's what has enabled it to grow and so rapidly over the last generation. But if you come to the United States to study economics, the neoliberal economics taught here cannot explain your success. And it also can't explain America's post-industrial failure. Privatization of land rent, healthcare, education, and other basic needs financed by more and more debt is viewed as a way to get rich, not poor. People think that if you borrow to buy housing, if you go into debt for education to get a degree, somehow your economic situation will be improved. But it isn't being improved in the United States. It gets worse and worse because the cost of buying a house, the cost of getting an education, the cost of privatizing the whole economy has turned out to be why America's industry is going down and why we're importing more and more from China. So on the national balance sheet, the rentier wealth, that is wealth that comes from rent seeking, from house rents, for finance, for natural resource ownership, for monopolies, all of this rent seeking has grown much faster than wages or industrial investment. And yet few economists and policymakers seem aware privatization and financialization that's occurring reverses the whole ideology that marked industrial capitalism at its takeoff during the classical economists of Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, people we spoke about in earlier lectures. Nobody expected in the 19th century that families would get rich by going into debt to borrow bank credit, and that the land rent would be paid to bankers as mortgage interest. In the 19th century, on almost all the countries, people expected the land's rent to become the tax base. It would be taxed away so that the government would not have to tax labor, would not have to tax capital. It would all be just from the rising value of the land rent. Instead, that has not occurred. Governments have even untaxed the land and its rent so that they can leave more and more of the rent available to be pledged to banks, to make loans, to bid up the price of property. And you've had bank credit inflating housing prices here and creating an idea that if you can go into debt to finance an increase in the value of a house, then that's creating wealth. And it's not really creating wealth, it's creating debt. People only look at one side of the balance sheet. Well, Britain, France, and most other nations spent most of the 19th century in a long political fight to break the power of the hereditary landlord class that was carried over from feudalism. The warlords had conquered Europe and taken the land for themselves, and they charged rent as a kind of tribute. And they also gained a stranglehold on politics, because the upper houses of almost all European countries, like the House of Lords in London, were in charge of writing the legislation and preventing themselves from being taxed. The House of Lords and the upper houses in France, Germany, the Senate in America, was able to block any kind of economic reform that would have favored industrial capitalism. And so you had the main reform movement in the 19th century was led by advocates of industrial capitalism against the remnants of feudalism, against the landlords that are left over. But that fight lost. By the end of the 19th century, rent wasn't taxed. In fact, landownership was democratized, but it was democratized on credit. In other words, the landed aristocracy of Europe basically sold out. They could see the handwriting on the wall. They could see they were about to be taxed. So, okay, they sold their lands over maybe 50 years, 100 years, and bought stocks and bonds and became a financial class. Well, as it became a financial class, that meant everybody could buy housing. And in America, 2/3 of Americans own their own homes. In Scandinavia, it's even more. About 80% of Scandinavians own their own homes. But obviously, if you're a worker living on a wage, how do you buy an expensive home? You have to borrow from a bank. So people borrowed in order to buy homes. And that seemed to be a very good thing at first. After World War II ended in 1945, borrowing to buy a home of your own, that became how to join the middle class. Home ownership became by far the main asset of the middle class, often the only asset, a small savings account, maybe a small retirement account. But if you look at the balance sheet of wealth in the United States, middle class wealth is mainly in their homes. But it's more and more of this wealth in their homes is owed to the bank. So now most of the ownership of real estate in the United States is owned to the bank, not to the nominal homeowner. So less and less is being left debt-free for the middle class to avoid, and the middle class is becoming what you could say a debtor class. Homeownership became the major asset, and because housing prices were going up, mainly the price of land. Bank profits also soared because the banks were getting rich off real estate mortgage. In America, about 80% of bank loans are mortgage loans for houses. So the banks and the financial sector have almost merged into a common sector. The homeowners after 1945 did get rich pretty much from 1945 to maybe 1975. Only white people were allowed to. Black people were not allowed to get mortgages from banks. The government would not guarantee and insure mortgages that were made to black people. They had to live in special neighborhoods or ghettos that were redlined, and banks wouldn't lend to them, and the cities wouldn't provide services there. So you had a kind of two-track economy. You had blacks living in rental income without homes. You had whites owning homes, and you had the inner cities falling apart so much that there was called white flight to the suburbs. White people moved out of the cities into the suburbs, and that left New York City near bankrupt in 1974. But beginning in the 1980s, inner cities began to be torn down, gentrified, and creating a whole new wave of debt finance to housing price inflation, and prices of housing have been soaring since about 1980. Nearly everybody from 1945 to the 1960s could buy a home with a 30-year self-amortizing mortgage. That meant that if you were member of the working class, you could go to a bank and they would see how much do you make. They would say, okay, you can afford to pay 1/4 of your income for the bank mortgage. And the bank mortgage will give you, it'll all be amortized itself. It'll be completely paid off in 30 years. And they figured 30 years is about as long as the working life of a normal. Obviously, when the banks wouldn't lend more to housing, housing was affordable. It was affordable because housing is worth whatever a bank is going to lend against it. And I'm sure it's the same thing in China. I'm sure that as lenders lend more and more, people can borrow more and bid up the price of housing. Something like that occurred in the United States, especially after about 1980. And so real estate prices are bid up when banks lend more. And the US Federal Housing Agency would allow banks to lend more and more. And today, the Federal Housing Authority will guarantee up to 43% of the borrower's income can be spent on mortgages that the governments will guarantee. 43% of the income on housing. And that means that rents also go up because rental housing costs so much that people won't rent it out for that much. So you have a whole rent squeeze in the United States. And you can imagine paying 43% of your income for housing and having to pay for taxes, Social Security, student debt, credit card debt. This leaves less and less money available to buy goods and services. And that's largely why the market is shrinking. That's the opposite of what finance capitalism and classical economics wanted to see in the 19th century. So this whole financialization of real estate has required getting rid of the whole tradition of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and free markets. For them, a free market was a market free from rent, free from the rentiers, free from what had been the landowning aristocracy, but also free from rent. And that's not the kind of free market today. A free market today is free for banks to charge whatever they want, free for the banks to get rid of the anti-usury laws, free for the rent seekers to reduce the rest of the economy to debt peonage. And this expanding financial layer, think of it as being wrapped around the production and consumption economy. And that's an inherent dynamic of finance capitalism. And the financial sector has merged with real estate and also the insurance sector. If you take out a mortgage in the United States, the bank says, well, you have to take out an insurance policy also, so that the insurance, if the house burns down or something goes wrong, you pay for the risk. We won't, the bankers take no risk at all in the United States. They cover themselves by putting all the risk onto the borrower. And yet the textbooks say that interest is a compensation for risk. But if interest is a compensation for risk, then interest rates would be zero, because there's no risk out to the bankers. The risk is all on the borrowers, all on the economy. And when people are insured, I've been insured against robbery, against breakdowns and piping. Insurance companies don't pay, or they try to postpone paying for as long as they can, often 5 years. The way to get rich in America, is just as in China and in Russia, is not to pay your debts. And who has the biggest debts are insurance companies, the financial sector, people like Donald Trump. He became a billionaire by not paying the debts to his workers, not paying his suppliers. That doesn't appear in the textbooks, but the economy doesn't work the way the law says the economy works, or the way that people think.
他这段分析呢，我觉得跟这个中国这个民主革命的先驱孙中山先生当年的一个很重要的分析可以直接结合。孙中山在发动这个民主革命的时候，早期也曾经明确的讲过，他说这个为什么要这个土地涨价归公，也就是说土地的 变性，你从农业用地变为工业用地，变为商业用地变为金融用地，无论变成什么，那都意味着土地的地租呢会有极差的增值。他说是叫做土地涨价归公。这个思路呢，跟刚才我介绍的这个哈德森这一讲的内容是高度契合的。他说，只要我能够把所有的地租收上来，由国家来占有，那我就能免掉所有的税收。那中国这时候如果是发展近代工业，假如你把租收上来，国家够开支了，也够用于基本建设了，那就可以免企业的税。所以他说，只要土地涨价归公，企业可以完全免税。和他这个思想其实一致的，也就是说，孙中山早期革命的时候他所提出的理论，和19世纪西方发生的这个政治经济学，就是古典政治经济学就提出这个地租的所谓原来的旧贵族占有的地租，那他应该怎么能够被征税？这个道理呢，就跟这个孙中山后来在中国发动所谓资产阶级民主革命的时候所提出的道理是一样的。看来内在的规律应该有很大的这个相同性。所以我说呢，这个学习这一节，应该大家理解，就是在进入这个工业化、进入实体经济发展这个过程中，对于原有的利益结构的调整是非常重要的。那好了，如果我们稍微对这个地租问题再多做几句分析，我们大家应该知道，最近这10年左右的所谓高增长，每年平均大约有10万亿左右土地的增值收益，而你一年大概100万亿左右，就是按去年来算吧，2019年不是2020年，2019年我们的这个 GDP 大约是在接近100万亿吧，就是大数算100万亿，那其中有1/10其实是土地带来的。那这些东西呢，很大程度上应该说有些这个不能说很大程度吧，有一定程度的是流失的，该征的没征上来。其实呢，我们也都知道，就是举个例子，比如说现在说深圳房价贵，很大程度上是因为深圳的这个城中村，它其实呢，这个城中村的各个利益群体那他们呢收的是这个床板租厂租、铺租等等，收的是租。这个租呢，其实很大程度上就是土地变性，它原来都是种地嘛，现在不种地了，种楼了，对吧？种厂子了。那当这样发生土地变性的时候呢，这个增值收益并没有像孙中山当年搞旧民主主义革命的时候所提出的涨价归公，而是归私了。那这一归私当然一方面呢是让这个一般的普通劳动者他们能够交比较低的房租，能够有个住的地方，但另外一方面呢，又使得这个当这些城中村被政府再次征用土地的时候呢，那开发商就不得不按照实际上变性了以后的那个地价来征地，于是会导致深圳的地价奇高，大大的高于像北京上海、广州这些原来的一线大城市，它几乎成了全国地价最高的地方。那大家就不理解说，那为什么这样？它因为地价高，它就把各种产业挤出去了。那特别是那些就是新兴产业，你一个城市你要想提高你的经济竞争力，一个国家也是一样的。如果你的这个整个这个劳动力成本在上升，劳动力成本又主要是要支付各种各样的这个房租房价，那于是乎当然它的竞争力就下降。所以这些呢，客观上导致大家也看到深圳有一些新兴产业外移这种现象。其实这个大家都可以联系在一起，这样我们能更好的理解这个迈克尔·哈德森教授他讲的这个对于租的这个如何影响西方经济的这个分析。好了，我给大家的提示就先说到这儿，我们接着呢听迈克尔·哈德森教授的讲课，谢谢。